Hello, folks. Welcome back to WW2 TV, and we are rounding off our week of Eastern Front Bagration coverage with a cracking presentation by Dr. Philip Blood. And it's been a great week. If you've learned as much as I have, then you're in for a treat today. And we're looking at it from the point of view of field and battlefield improvisation. We know how it is with Dr. Blood, with the conversation will kind of meander back and forth and give us lots of things to think about, which is what we want. So I'll bring you in now. Good afternoon, Phil. How are you today?
Hi, Woody. Great to see you, mate.
So,
having me on again.
Well, you're part of the team now, so we'll bring the PowerPoint up straight away, and we'll kind of just tell us when to nudge on slides. So, lot to get through. We'll do with some of your questions, folks, but I think basically we'll kind of hand over Phil to take us through this, and the floor is yours, sir.
Okay, so if we go to the first slide, the next one, that's it. If we kind of look at the whole terrain here, we're looking at a continent which is in conflict and across 1,320 odd miles. And in that area, there is fighting going on in the West, which some people used to say is less violent than the kind of fighting that's going on in the East. And one of the things that I was very interested in understanding is, was there a difference between the German soldier in the East and the German soldier in the West? And that's kind of the undercurrent of what I'm going to be talking about today. So if we could just move on. I look at Operation Bagration with a slight eye to the Polish-Soviet War of 1919-1920, simply because that is still prominent in the mindset of many of the participants, especially on the Russian side. And we know that Bagration will end up in Warsaw, and there's controversy and all of that. I'm not going into the controversy. I'm just acknowledging the fact that I, as a historian, tend to shadow with the Polish-Soviet War. And if we can move on. Obviously, in Russia, the Soviet Union, the Red Army memory, the war's impact, it was huge. There's state history, there's memoir history, and sometimes, like with these two guys, state and individual were kind of linked. And you can't really break away and look in behind and see some of the stuff that you would really want to as a historian 80 years later. And in terms of this Russian map, just for people to see how big an area that I'm dealing with, the yellow line right at the center there is the 65th Army of the Second Belarusian Front, pouncing through, and that's the area where we're going to be looking at. So if we move on. Just very briefly, because people ask me about books. In Britain, there was a company called Hutchinson. During the Second World War, they were publishing Soviet history books, Soviet records, Soviet studies, and many of this took hold. There was a great interest in Britain for the Eastern Front and Russia. And of course, the idea that Britain's alone and then Russia's involved and on the same side, and Churchill and Stalin become buddies. There's a sense for a period, going into the mid-60s when Russia is perhaps treated kindly. And we get to the 1968 invasion by Warsaw Pact armies into Czechoslovakia. There's a change. And really you see a new swing coming back with John Ericsson, and then subsequently with Chris Bellamy, who was, who some people might know was my second examiner when I was being examined by Richard Holmes. So we just move on. On the American side, perhaps one of the most famous ones is The Soviet Partisans by John Armstrong. This was a series of essays that were written by specialists back in the day. And it was all to do with the idea that somehow the Soviet partisans were going to creep behind lines before a Cold War conflict turns into a hot war. And there were these major studies which were very significant. The study was paid for by the United States Air Force. The Belarusian book is interesting to me because I actually met Dave Glantz and we talked a long time at CMH. And he has a view of that war from being an operative in the American services, diplomatic service, working in Moscow. And we've mentioned these other books before, so let's move on. One of the images that comes out of the Soviet journalists talking about the war is mass, the artillery and the tanks, but also at the same time, which seems to have got forgotten, was how much the Russians are very appreciative of American motor vehicles.
Yep.
This has kind of got lost in the story. The Russians are pushing all this heavy artillery and tanks and equipment into the east, and you can look at the mass in this map that was drawn on behalf of Karl-Heinz Frieser for the Germany in the Second World War series, and you can see the mass difference between the two sides. But the one side that gets forgotten is while the Russians are producing big armaments, they're getting a lot of support, and all their mobility is largely coming from the Americans. And so you have this kind of strange mix between state munitions, state factories, and capitalism. And that adds another twist to the overall story of the war in the East. If we move on. And the maps haven't changed. That's all this story is here. If you look at the little blue box, that's the area where we're focusing on. Bialystok, Bielsk-Podilsky, Hanovka, Biavisha. That's my area, and we'll continue. Well, yep. We have to remember the political warfare element in this whole operation. Perhaps the most important bit is the capture of Minsk. And the significance of Minsk is it's the capital of Belarus. And as soon as that's captured, there is a wave of uprising and resistance that literally runs through the east behind the German lines. And where there had been wavering, there is certainly a sudden change. So there is this political element which is very important. Now, if you look at the smaller map, Minsk is actually 4 days away from where the troops I'm going to be talking about today. So you can see the impact of that double envelopment around Minsk was huge. And if you look very closely, perhaps you can just see them, all the little blue lines moving off to my left of the map, where the German soldiers have broken through the encirclement and are flooding back. These stragglers, these units, hit the forest where we're going to be talking about, and they bring news of what's coming. So if we move on. So we get to the first improvisation. Now, command change is very important, and it's really significant when you're looking at what happens in the area which we're going to discuss. So if we move on. Now, all of this stuff that I mentioned here and in the next one, I raised in the talk that we had some time ago, Woody, when we talked about the book Birds of Prey. So I'm lingering for a second, and if we can move on. All of this is covered in that previous talk, so they can...
And the link is in the description below, folks. So if you haven't seen it already, just watch it when you've got time later today.
Excellent. The thing that I just want people to notice now is we've gone from Nazi doctrine of Bandenbekämpfung to Nazi doctrine of defending the Reich. And on the 13th of July, the senior commanders have gone, and now there's this group that's left. So if we move on. Yeah, next one.
Yeah.
So that was where the headquarters was. That's the old palace. Goering called his favourite friend to Remington in East Prussia, and the whole of that kit and caboodle literally disappeared. So again, mentioned in the previous presentation. So if we move on. What wasn't mentioned and is not often understood is how much East Prussia was Luftwaffe's, if you like, home area, with vast sources. If you look at the White Eagle, that was representative of Luftgau 1, which is the whole of a kind of a Nazi district for the Luftwaffe. You've got fighter stations, but below that eagle, the eagle without any swastika, is the badge of the Hermann Goering Panzer Division, and all of its establishments are in that area. And of course, the blue badge with the golden eagle, that's Hermann Goering, and you can just about see him doing his thing in Remington. So if we move on, so you have a command change. If we move on, it's only just little breaks for people. So there are 4 characters who are going to be the main theme in this. One is Room, who takes over from Fravor. One is Meinecke, who is a senior lieutenant. Unteroffizier König, who we don't know very much about. And then Zahlmeister, supply officer Meyer. So if we move on, I mentioned if anybody wants to read a book, it's The Willing Flesh. These are the troops which I discussed before when we did the presentation. Just a quick overview. 2 officers, 47 NCOs, 350 men, about 204 Soviet Russian Heavies, some Poles, 2 platoons of the Hermann Goering Division. And that picture I found recently. So that's the new bit that I wanted people to see. That's actually a Hermann Goering detachment working within this Kampfgruppe room. Right. Okay, if we move on.
Just a quick question for you, Phil.
Go ahead.
You mentioned earlier the phases within the historiography from the Soviet side. So the kind of the wartime propaganda era, the post-war era, then the sort of the post-68, and then the end of Glasnost and the end of the Cold War era. And obviously we're in a different era now. With the understanding from the German side, has that been more consistent over the 80 years, or has that seen a little bit of kind of changing as well?
There is a lot of change on the German side, because I think German scholars have looked at it from a wider perspective. They've taken in things like the Holocaust, the social side, the bomb plot. There's a more, what I would say is in Germany, and you look at Karl-Heinz Friese's book, and then you look at some of the others, there's a certain sophistication to how they appreciate what's actually happened. They're more mindful of the Nazis, whereas if you'd have gone back to the 60s and 70s, it was, oh, poor us, we were left in the lurch by Hitler, and, you know, all of that stuff.
Okay, thanks.
Standard Luftwaffe soldiers, they're not much different from 1941 when the German army moved in. What's significant about this picture is I just wanted to show the Hermann Goering platoon has MG-42 machine guns, whereas the poor bloody infantry of Room's Kampfgruppe have the machine gun 0815. That's quite an interesting term, because in, you know, that's a machine gun from the First World War, which has been regunned and redone. So if we move on.
There we go.
Just a general scene. I managed to find some scenes of living quarters and lodgings in the area. So you can see that these soldiers are not exactly living in luxury. It's pretty miserable surroundings. Anyway, move on. So breakthrough Biavisha. So this is where we get down to stuff which have not discussed before. So if we go to the first slide. Now, all of the forests in the east are very, very swampy. And a lot of people talk about this, but also you get areas where there's just literally lakes. And these lakes appear to be very deep. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. The significant thing about this is back in 1941, during the period of the Holocaust of bullets, the SS were driving Jews into these swamplands in the expectation the Jews were going to drown. And you would get reports from people like Fegelein, the SS commander, saying, well, they're only up to their waists in water. So they're very, very deceptive. The idea that you could just drown people in here hadn't worked in 41. Now you're going to have tanks coming through this area. How difficult is it to actually prevent the tanks coming through? And this is an important factor, which often, historians who are remote from the scene, who don't know the ground, kind of miss sometimes. And that's why I want to bring into the talk here.
I think it's because we always have such large maps. Those maps you started with, whereas perhaps in the West, we tend to kind of go down a deeper dive to kind of almost, company and battalion level is quite common when you're looking at the campaigns in Normandy and Italy. But I think the lens is different when we look at the Eastern Front. We do tend to look at entire fronts, and we're astonished by the numbers. I think some of the terrain gets a little bit of neglected because of that.
Well, I think it's very important. If you're going to understand Bagration, you really need to have a sense of the terrain.
Yeah.
And it changes rapidly from one to another, as will become apparent as we're continuing talking. Now, here's Rokokovsky, and we've heard all about him, but his second Belarusian front is aimed at breaking through this forest because it's key to getting into Prussia and then to the beginning of the Eastern Plain, Great European Plain. So he knows the other side of this forest is fairly reasonably firm ground, and he can then release his forces. The interesting thing, and I thought this would be interesting for the guys, is how he broke it up. Because, we know the cavalry and the tank brigades, which is the two at the bottom, but you would have the mobile troops, the infantry, riding on M3 hard tracks and the scout cars going through the middle. And then to the north, you would have these Stalin organs, the Katyushas and the 152 self-propelled guns going on more firmer roads. And I initially thought this is a bizarre way of doing stuff. What I hadn't realized is actually with those artillery at the top, you've got tank screens and infantry screens. Plus you've got the screen which the infantry is running at anyway with its mobility. And then you've got the cavalry reconnoitering as they're going through the forest, telling people, communicating what's here, what's there, what's passable, what isn't. Also making communication with the partisans. So you first look at these three columns and you think, this is odd, when actually it's a very clever way of getting through the forest very quickly. So if we just move on. Now, for those who love their films, Liberation was a film made in 1967. And believe it or not, the director reenacted all of the great scenes of Russian memory. And here you are, you see a T-34 going on a cardboard road, tree stumps, and you've got infantry struggling with anti-tank guns through great swamps, and you've got the cavalry there. It always interested me that the cavalry got kind of pushed aside a little because it kind of gave the impression that the Soviet Union was a backward state.
Yeah,
you have to have the tanks and the artillery being pulled by trucks, where the cavalry sadly doesn't take the position which it should have in the film. But anyway, for those people who really want to understand or see the terrain and see the operations, this is the nearest thing you will get to actually seeing somebody recreating the Battle of
my advice is just fast forward the bits of Stalin talking, because he comes across a little bit too cuddly, doesn't he? He's just he's like Father Christmas, isn't he? He's just being so kind to everybody and such a lovely, benevolent person. So go, and then gets the battle scenes, and it's
totally cracks me up. Totally cracks me up. But again, as I say, to actually have done the battle scenes on the Berezina River, I mean, wonderful. Anyway,
they're all on YouTube, by the way. You can find them.
Yep, they are indeed. So as you can see, the roads are not muddy and horrible and wet. And as you can see, on literally the same time as the second Belarusian troops are moving through Białystok Forest, I'm standing on one of the roads, and you can see how solid they are. Yeah. And yes, they would take a T-34 and anything else. So the idea that this is an unbreachable wilderness, utter nonsense. And so they break through. And as you can see in the film, there you have the partisans riding the tanks. I didn't find any cases of that, but
right. Okay.
Anyway, we move on. So small unit combats, which for me is the kind of exciting bit, the wargaming thing. So if we move on, so the battle area, the arena we're in for the first stage of the battles I'm talking about today is these 13 miles. What you see from this Google map is how green this area is. Now, believe it or not, this forest is thinner than it was in 1916 when it was first occupied by the German army. and it's a lot thinner than it was when it was passed through by the 65th Army in 1944. But still, from a satellite position, you can see how dense this forest is. And these are the two key towns. So Białystok was where the battalion headquarters of the Jägersonderkommando of the Luftwaffe was based, and Hanova was the railway link for the whole area, because obviously they were taking forestry and wood out, and they were piling it in Hanova and taking it off. So there's the battle space. So if we move on. So the first meeting engagement is really confused. So I'm sorry if people find this picture confusing, but I will try and explain it to go along. So you've got the three columns coming through. At the top, the 152 artillery is going through, and they're going through a road which can't be seen very easily from either the palace or from where the Panther tank is. So it looks like they're all close, but nobody can see what's happening as they're passing. Where the infantry is going, they're placing their anti-tank guns and taking up positions in the old palace, which the Luftwaffe had vacated. The column at the bottom, the cavalry and the tanks were moving forward, and they were uncertain. Now, the Germans, they didn't know how far things were going, so they assumed, well, we'll block the main road, because the main Białystok-Hanova road, which is where the Pioneer Battalion is, we're going to block that road. And so they start mining. So this is literally on the 16th of July. The Pioneers are mining when the cavalry turn up. At the same time, the tanks move in from nowhere. They come without warning. They just suddenly turn up. They're Panther tanks from the Viking SS Panzer Division, which had just arrived in Hanova that morning. They come racing into the ground in the belief that the palace needs defending, not that the palace needs attacking. The two companies of Luftwaffe troops, Panzer and Meinecke to the south, and Schroeter and König in the north, they were already leaving when the tanks turned up. The tanks turn up, Panzer and Meinecke leap on the backs of the two or three Panthers. There's some debate whether it's two or three. They hit the palace, and then it all goes a bit crazy. So if we go to the next slide. So I mentioned how bad the roads are. For Panthers, this area is a disaster. So fortunately, this bridge survived, and it's still, as far as I'm aware, the same bridge from back in the day. And you can see why the rivers would have been difficult for a Panther to get up. But because the bridge was there, they came swinging along the road from Hanova, which is the top picture. They cross the river at the bottom picture, and in the middle picture, they literally shoot up the hill and force the Russian infantry to abandon their guns, hightail it out with their mobile in their Mark III half tracks. So if we move on. So you can now see this mayhem of activity going on. What actually, as you come down, you've actually got Room, who's taking his command post and his backup teams, and the reserve company are trying to get to Hanova, which is why Schroeter and Panzer and Meinecke were shielding them, because they thought that the Russians were going to go beyond the palace. They then go back into action, and Panzer is actually the battalion doctor, and he leaps onto one of the first Panthers and takes the fight into the palace. Now, the interesting thing is here, the Kampfgruppe didn't have any heavy weapons, so they grab the anti-tank guns. So the improvisation is here. You grab the guns, you grab the shells, and then you hightail it. So if we go on. Now, as they're trying to gather the guns, the cavalry, the Russian cavalry and the T-34s hit them hard and literally splinter them into different places. So Room is leading, getting back to Hanova. Schroeter and Panzer managed to go with the guns, with the main group of Jägersonderkommando, through two significant areas of forest which allows them to escape, which the Russians don't follow, and even the cavalry don't follow. What you'll notice in the picture is the cavalry start to go towards the artillery because they think the Germans are now going to attack the artillery, which is exposed, and they want to screen that to make sure the artillery isn't going to get attacked. So luckily, the Russians capture the palace, but don't follow up. However, in all of this madness going on, as Company Meinecker is trying to break through and get back, it's suddenly attacked by the Hungarian army. And the report of these attacks came from nowhere. And so we're going to have to talk about it in a little bit in a while. But at the moment, this is the kind of chaos of a wild retreat. Now, what's interesting, at the same time as this fight's going on, Kampfgruppe Röhm has gone from being under Stab Stefan to under a Grenadier Regiment. And nobody's actually informed them until they get to Hanovka. So this constant command change is a bit of a German thing, especially when the fighting gets really heavy and the moving from one area to another, overlapping commands, gets a bit chaotic. So if
Phil, just a quick question for you, and I hate to interrupt your flow, but do we know how much anticipation there was on the Soviet side of the Germans doing kind of counterattacking and kind of advancing towards them, or did they kind of just think the Germans were going to do their typical hold, fall back, hold, fall back? How much of this was a surprise to them?
I think what actually happened with the Panthers was an utter surprise. It was a surprise. It was a surprise to the Luftwaffe because they came from nowhere. And if you actually read the orders of the Viking, they weren't supposed to be doing that. They were supposed to be defending Bialystok.
Right.
So they've arrived in Bialystok. Bialystok has told them, get to Hanovka. The troops there are under threat. It's quite possible, given the politics, that the Waffen-SS are protecting Goering's interests. Who knows? That's not anything I can do more than but speculate. The fact is the Panthers turn up. Meinecker later reports it's a shock. The Russians, however, after the first initial shock, someone's attacked us, they immediately launch into an aggressive operation. And if you look at the Red Crosses, that's the artillery strikes. They are really pounding that area, trying to get those Germans to run. And that for me is kind of fascinating because I thought these Russians are all going to be not connected. They're going to operate as separate columns. But again, looking at it more closely and then reading into the reports from the Germans, and you see how their fire operations are going and how much damage they're suffering, it's quite serious.
I was just going to make that point. Their combined arms seems pretty damn good at this point. Not the blunt instrument we often label them as.
No.
Moving on?
Yeah, please. So I had to put this here because even I just laugh about it. So you're running away with stolen artillery. You nicked off the Russians, and you're desperate to get away from artillery. So you're going for all this impassable forestry. But one group of German soldiers literally go to the bison compound to make sure the bison are okay, to tell the Reichsführer the bison are okay. And they actually wrote that in a report. Move on.
I was going to make some kind of on the horns of a dilemma joke, but I'm not going to. I have now done it by not doing it.
Yeah, I thought it better to hoof it. Anyway, so all but Meinecker have reached Hanovka. And Hanovka is part of the German railway system because it's been introduced into Germany. It's part of the Greater German Reich. So 4 SS trains have unloaded in that area, and it's under the control of this Grenadier Regiment. The fascinating thing about the Grenadier Regiment is it's actually only been in operation for about 14 days. It's raised as a Polish reserve in the Polish areas from a reserve division. It suddenly bumps up and then straight to Army Group Centre. Army Group Centre committed to Hanovka as a protection force. When Röhm tries to counter the Russian attacks on Hanovka, again, they get heavily stonked. This time they think they're being stonked by Stalinorgan, the Katyushas. So they get it twice. The first time was on the 17th, early evening, 5 o'clock, and they get it again on the 18th. On the 18th of July, they said, that's it. You know, we're not doing this anymore, because the Katyushas are really causing damage. And I managed to find a picture from 1945 from a local Polish book, just to show the area was completely and utterly flattened. These pictures were taken around about, my own pictures were taken about 2006, I think. And you can see pretty much a loading area for logs. It would have been very easy for the SS trains when they came in to unload, because there were log loading ramps like the half track there being unloaded. Anyway, let's move on. So Meineker's running through another side of the south of the forest, and he's under a lot of fire from the Hungarians. So if we just move on, you can see it's a clear road. Anyway, we move on. Now, the interesting thing about the Hungarians, which the Germans don't understand why they're attacking them, this is where there's a bigger picture comes into the frame of the battle, if you like. Hungary has been under occupation since March 19. Budapest has been under occupation by the Germans since March 1944. Now, what's interesting about that occupation is almost within a couple of months, Adolf Eichmann starts the Holocaust process, which is the extermination of Hungarian Jewry, which that kicks off in May. So while all of this fighting is going on, in Hungary, there is a process of the Holocaust. So is there tensions from what's been going on? I wouldn't be surprised. Do I understand why the Germans don't understand why the Hungarians are shooting at them? Probably, because I suspect the Hungarians have had enough and will eventually anyway change sides. There is a confusion in how involved the Hungarians were in Nazi crimes. I put a film there, Natural Light, which came out about 3 or 4 years ago. It's Hungarian soldiers operating in these forests fighting partisans. It's a brutal film, but for people who are interested in this, that's something. Anyway, that's the Hungarian story. Shall we move on? On the 17th of July, while all of this is going on, the soldiers who've been captured in the first breakthroughs are put through the parade of the vanquished. Now, whether the German soldiers know this is going on, I don't know. But the filming of the German soldiers marching through Moscow as prisoners of war and paraded as they were seems to tie with the moment when the Germans start to fight differently. I don't know whether it's significant, whether it's that, or whether it's an act of desperation, but I just put that there as a poser, you know, something we should think about. Anyway, move on. So the Kampf group then tries to retreat to Bielsk-Podlaski. And now in this area, they fall under the 4th Panzer Division, which has moved into the area and is about to strike at the 65th Army on the flanks. Now they cross over the Orlanka River. The white line on the first map with the cross line, the white line is from Hanovka to Bielsk, and the little white line is where they take up positions along the Orlanka River. Now, if we move on, so you can basically see it's not a very wide river. It's significant though, because it will hold people up. So, you know, bridges, but they haven't got anything to blow the bridge up with. So they've crossed the bridge with their stolen Russian anti-tank guns, but they can't blow it up. And nobody's supplying them with any dynamite. So they've got to fight this area. And it becomes quite aggressive for a period, even though they've got a Panzer regiment next to them. They're not getting any tank help. So if we move on. So as you can see, they're put into a position where they're screening a Panzer Division attacking the flank of the 65th Army. And these poor guys, they've got 3 or 4 stolen Russian anti-tank guns. They've got the Hermann Goering Panzer Grenadiers who know how to fight. There's no doubt about that. But they're facing all of this. And what you actually get happening, which I find interesting, in the middle of the fight, Room is killed by a mortar grenade. And instead of Meinecke or Schroeter or Wanzer taking over as officer commanding, they allow Unteroffizier König to take over, and he leads the fight. So you have 2 days of serious to and fro battling. And I've got a little arrow in blue, which is going one way and then the other way. Now, what König does on the last event is he knows that the Russians have brought up the 152s. He knows the cavalry are going round, are trying to flank him. So he does the move. He actually takes the troops out of the trenches, lets the Russians stomp the empty trenches, and then he takes them back into the trenches and takes up the fight. But here's the kicker. He then gets them out of the trenches and actually chases the Russian tank crews and the Russian infantry down the street. It causes a panic. Then he takes them all back again. And then they have a hard night, being stomped all night, and lose about 20 guys. And then the next morning, the Panzer Regiment says, well, you did well. Now you can go home. That's it. And before you go, leave all your radios and all your ammunition and just go home. So we're going to the next one. So we're on to Panzer Actions, because obviously guys are going to be interested in.
We all like tanks. Yeah, yeah.
So you've got this moment, which is like a sentence in nearly all of the books. In Rokossowski's memoirs, it's very interesting how he explains that 65th Army gets slammed on the flanks at this point. And if you look at the black and white map, the red bit is where Rokossowski's main force, Belarusian Front 1, has hit Praga in Warsaw. But at the same time, the boundary area being between 2nd and 1st is being attacked up in the north. And you can see the blue line is the retreat line of Kampfgruppe Rum. So you've got all of this activity going on. Now, if you look on the right-hand side, you can actually see the Waffen-SS division has come back from Bialystok and now gone completely full-on smash, and has hit the 65th Army in the south of its flanks and has actually driven down towards Kamenets-Limetsk, and at the same time taken Topoli. The 4th Panzer Division, with its 2 strikes, which are Sturmgeschütz on one and Mark IVs on the other, are really coming down on the 65th, giving it a tough time. And Batov, the 65th commander, he gets away with it. He stays in command, I believe, until 1945. But it was not an easy game. And, we think about these small unit operations with the Panzers. We think they're not doing, they're not done too much. There is a moment there, because if you look now back to the black and white picture, you see 2 lines going around Praga. Mm-hmm. What the Germans are actually thinking now with Guderian is, if these Russians cross over and take Warsaw, we're going to put them into Operation Tannenberg. We're going to encircle the whole of this lot, and we're going to do what the German army did in the First World War, and we're going to muller them. Ultra comes along. Stalin gets the message. This is what they're doing. They don't cross the water, but they carry on fighting. The Russians trying to cross in Warsaw. In my book, Hitler's Bandit Hunters, Baksalevsky was constantly having to fight Russian assault boats trying to get across the river. I know it's a political issue with Poland and Russia, but the evidence is they didn't cross because they felt this operation was going to encircle them. Now, if we move on. What's interesting about looking at small unit tactics is when you're trying to find information, you come across little pieces which are suddenly very interesting. Now, Kampfgruppe Groom had been placed under 2nd Army area, and its chief of staff was Henning vonTesco. Now, for those who remember and know, he was party to the bomb plot on the 20th of July. And when it failed, he went into Creole Most Forest, pulled a hand grenade out and killed himself. Okay. According to the operations officer of the Viking, when he met Tresco, Treskov was odd. He gave a strange briefing and it didn't make any sense to them. And this was on the 19th of July, like the day before. And so I started to think around, you know, the German command has behaved pretty badly. They're making strange reports. They're not responding to the situation as you would have expected them. I mean, in the West, every time the Allies make a breakthrough, major panic and everybody's doing their work. This lot seem a little bit, you know, it's going to be over soon. So I asked you a question, you know, or series of questions. Was Tresco spooked by the sudden appearance of the SS? And then started to raise questions, and I haven't answered them all, but, you know, was German resistance wider on the east than we believe? Were they prepared to let this thing die? And do those explain the kind of laxical behavior of the German generals in Bagration in the first part? Yeah. And are they odd? Because, you know, you think about Bush and people say, well, you know, Bush is a capable officer in 1941, suddenly becomes a dickhead in 1944. And you think, no, that doesn't work. That does not happen in the German army. They're far too professional to behave like that. So something's going on. And I've been very suspicious of that. There's also this idea, well, you know, we're not going to take any orders from Hitler, and then we are going to take orders from Hitler. And you think, well, hang on, what's it going to be? You're going to retreat or you're not going to retreat? You're going to stay in your Festung or you're not going to stay in your... And none of it, you know, I'm very suspicious about the whole story.
It must have muddied things. It must have muddied the water. You know, I mean, we talk about the assassination attempt in the West as, you know, it throws the leadership into all sorts of, you know, who are the loyal people, who are the disloyal people, etc. But I don't know that I've really connected it to the East as much until today. As usual, Dr. Phil, you've given my brain things to go and think about later on.
Well, I'm not saying it's fact. I'm not saying it's fact. But when an operations officer, I mean, operations officers in the German army and the Waffen-SS are not idiots by any stretch of the imagination. I'm sure Douglas Nash and, you know, his knowledge of the Viking is far more advanced than mine. But I'm sure if he said, you know, that guy is capable, he's expecting a proper briefing to know what to do. And to not get a proper briefing to a Panzer Division in situ, which is, you know, they're the 7th Cavalry, if you like, of what's going on here. And to get a nonsense report is odd. It's even odder because Treskov is one of these, you know, top guys. So why would he be? So I just don't think I don't think any of them have got their mind on it because they've got their mind elsewhere. And he in particular. Because within 24 hours, you're going to have the bomb plot. Within 48 hours, he's dead.
Yeah.
And that puts an odd time frame into things. Anyway. So orderly retreat. This is all going to be very quick now, I'm afraid. So as you can see, from Bielorz, Podlaski to Lomsha, they are given generously pony transport and horses, and they trundle along. It's only 58 miles, so it takes for a while. And then go on to the next one. You can see the countryside. I've actually done the route, did it twice because I quite like the area.
That photo on the left, that could be France. That could be one of the tree-lined, sort of slightly raised roads that you see all over Normandy in the north of France. That's yeah. Amazing.
I thought I would put that there to remind you of that joke about, you know, trees along the sides of
Trees,
roads.
yeah. They can, viewers can find their own joke there. Yeah, why did the French have trees on the road? Yeah. Look it up, folks. Yeah. We were compared to Morecambe and Wise earlier. It could be worse. Could be Cannon and Ball, couldn't it? Or the Crankies.
The Crankies. So anyway, let's move on. So they get to Lomsha, and now this is where Meyer comes in. Meyer has actually been supporting them all along. So you think this big, lumpy supply officer isn't going to be quite as aggressive as the rest of them, but he is. And he's been monitoring them all the time. And every time they've needed supply, he's jumped on a motorcycle, he's got the vehicles that actually are motor vehicles, and he's driven supply to the troops. And then he's monitored them as they've moved. And in Lomsha, he picks them up, and they then traveled 103 miles to Remington and Hermann Goering's headquarters. So if we go on, that was the countryside in 1937, and it hasn't changed now. So if you move on, I found this house fascinating. I wondered who'd lived there. I don't know. It's just an empty, abandoned house, and move on. You know, Germans. And then they finally get home in stages between the 25th of July and the 1st of August. It's obviously the horses take a little bit longer. 3rd of August, Meinecke and Meyer and Koenig start writing their reports. Schroeter's given the job of making sure all of their equipment is given away, because for the great achievement that they've made, they're going to get resupplied with new equipment. Most of them get sent to Holland, where they become part of the Hermann Goering Panzer Division. Holland is the training ground for the Hermann Goering Panzer Division, or was. It remained that for a while. Hermann Goering the division will take part in the attempt to do Operation Tannenberg around Warsaw. But anyway, that's another story. So we move on. And they enter the illusion of paradise and safety. East Prussia, as you can see, loads of Luftwaffe barracks, all the airfields, the training airfields, the engineering design fields, the technical schools. You know, East Prussia is the home of the Luftwaffe, or Goering's staff headquarters, as you can see. It will last until October, November. And then, of course, you get into those famous incidents like Nemensdorf, which is down to the south of that area, and the breakthroughs, and then the vicious fighting. And Hermann Goering kills Leutnant, his last famous stag. I think it's on the 9th of October 1944, to the sound of the guns. Very Wagnerian, Teutonic, and that's the end of the story. So if you can jump on to the next one. So a summary of improvisations and small unit tactics. My view, the reason why they're able to get away with what they do is because literally there's no high command interference. These boys just get on with it. And, you know, within that, what I find fascinating, if you look closely, and we could have done a bit more time maybe, was the decision-making under fire. I mean, these lads are fighting and making decisions. And that fascinates me, because they're not supposed to be that good. Everyone says, you know, they're all falling apart, they're running away. They're not. They run when they're getting stonked. Who wouldn't? But when they get a chance, they take their breath and they fight back. I think they're relying on that inner professionalism. And it certainly shows with Unteroffizier Koenig, and it certainly shows with the Panzer commander. I didn't go into much detail with him, but he struck me as the 35th Panzer Regiment's commander certainly knew what he was doing. And he was making sure, even though he wasn't giving them tank support, he was keeping them completely monitored by sending a lieutenant to monitor what was going on, to make sure they were okay, that Unteroffizier Koenig got all his supplies. For the 35th Regiment, they make huge penetration of the Russian flanks. The Viking, they kind of go on this crazy, well, we're going to go wherever we want to go. And I find that fascinating. You know, there is a story there. People talk about it, obviously. Room, he has to, I think once Fravert's gone, Room is released and he becomes the officer that is there. All of his personnel combat reports are quite interesting. They say underneath there's a really professional soldier waiting to get out. He just needs combat experience. And he's 40 years of age, and his behavior is really quite exceptional compared to what was going on before he arrived at the battalion. They seem to, you know, if you remember in one of in the program I talked about, one of the Jagdkommando was completely destroyed just before Room arrived, and that never happened again. He made sure that they were properly trained before they went out on operations against Soviet partisans. And I think the other thing is, it's very interesting that the Germans go back to using their tried and trusted tactics. You know, you'd think, well, where did that go? And why has it come back again suddenly? So something's happened. I can't put my finger on it. I can't tell whether it's some National Socialist dogma or whether it's military dogma or it's a change in capabilities, whether it's the new wave of troops coming through because they're young, the 1924 age bracket, who knows? But there is certainly a shift back to the old tactics.
And do you think there's, in this, I mean, obviously the steamroller is moving west. The Soviet steamroller is only going in one direction, and it's only going to end in a Soviet and consequently Allied victory. But there are these glimmers of stubborn defense, as you say, their professionalism. They're reverting some tactics that served them well earlier in the war. Is any of that filtering through to kind of give, despite this steamroller coming at them, the confidence to do things they do later in the war, like the Ardennes offensive, like the trying to rescue the defenders of Budapest? The other, they're not out of the fight yet by any means. The Third Reich, there are still some significant dents they're going to make in Allied progression later on. So is some of that the seeds of little glimmers of hope in this defense?
Yeah, I think so, because whatever happens, all of these reports get written into bigger reports. And I'm not saying that they spend months and years writing reports and then thinking about it. Combat reports are being written in 24 hours. They're then taken to a higher command where another report comes along, and then a feasibility study is made, and then a report comes back. This was good. This was good. I think the reason why Koenig and the guys has taken into the Hermann Goering Division as a reconnoitering unit is because they've proven that they're useful, and you want that quality of experience being put to a major fighting organization. So I think where there's a possibility of the German Army High Command absorbing knowledge from what's happened at the front, they will very quickly turn it round to use to their advantage. However, and I will go on about this, what happens in the West is so destructive to the Panzer divisions, especially the 1st and the 12th SS divisions. They don't really recover. And knowing, after the last talked about firepower and the running away thing, people will read that in more detail when I do the Aachen book, when they talk about Herbert Rinck's running away. It's not that they're cowards. It's the fact that they have been so bloodied, they've been so shattered and destroyed. They've got no choice. So what's happening in the West, go back to that first slide. What happens in the West is different from what happens in the East. The East are taking to a certain extent, the East is taking a bigger tonking than the West. But what the West has done, what Montgomery has done with all of that attrition, is he's destroyed the power, the fighting power of the Wehrmacht. And it will never, it'll have the operations in the Ardennes, as you said, and it'll have the Arnhem, and it'll do stuff here, there, and everywhere. But it will never have that fighting power that it has in Normandy. That will never come back, because Montgomery has shattered too many Panzer divisions, and you cannot recover all of that and hope to rebuild. And if you look at what happened in round about the 16th of January 1945, Steiner, who is the Vikings' first commander, he's now a corps commander, I think, or an army commander, he writes a feasibility study, which is, we need to have more of the new machine gun, you know, the 44. You're going to have smaller units, and your offensive operations are going to be on a micro basis. They're going to be limited to counterattacks, and we're going to win less and less. And the divisions are going to be basically 2 Kampfgruppen. So they're already planning then, and it's the same with the Luftwaffe. You know, everyone's saying, well, the the Heinkel 162, the Salamander, is this single jet, people's jet, load of rubbish. But actually, if you read the feasibility studies, it's going to replace the whole of the Luftwaffe front line by June 1945. And the only problem is the war ends before they can do that. And they can't do it. They just don't have the resources. So there's a lot going on. Yes, they're actually better. You know, here's an odd thing. They're probably better soldiers in 1945 than they were in 1940. You went quiet. You went quiet.
Yeah, no, but it's how you define better, isn't it? As well, it's, you know, we're back to the West again, and the stupid foolhardy charges that 12th SS and other units sometimes do that seem to be kind of, you know, oh, look at what they can do there, but they end up running into artillery and getting stopped. You know, it's when does impressive become foolish? When does brave become stupid? When, you know, when does, you know, these are the questions that we ponder all the time.
When I say better, what I'm saying is, as soldiers, as professional soldiers, right, they're better because they've had the experience of combat. They're not doing the foolhardy stuff that they were doing before, which is why, and that's very odd. If you look at some of the late combat reports in March, April 1945, German soldiers are being stubborn and fighting hard. Well, actually, that's probably because they're better than they were at fighting that kind of situation a year before. So I don't know. I mean, there's still a lot to discover, but, you know, just looking at this little area, how the men responded to the operations, the way the 2 Panzer divisions operate, there's food for thought there.
Basically, there's no value in us as students of history to just think that the Red Army is just rolling over these units without any issue at all, and there's no moments where it could go the other way. There's no moments where the Germans are pulling things out the bag. There's no learning to be done out of that. Whereas this is presenting this idea that there are shades of grey.
Well, I forget the numbers, but even in Berlin, the Russians are going to lose about 120,000 men.
Yeah, I mean that came up in the question with Hughes' talk last night. Is why are the Russians losing 700,000 or something in Bagration? You know, if the Germans are making them pay for every inch with blood, and they wouldn't do that if they were totally useless. And again, a couple of people in the sidebar are suggesting that we're not fervently enough kind of talking about how shitty the Third Reich ideology is, because of course we are. We've both done lots of shows on this channel about how shitty they are, and their ideology absolutely sucks balls, folks. But it doesn't mean we can't at some point sometimes point out that they are able to handle combat with some proficiency.
Well, I think the problem for me as a cultural military historian as such, nearly everything I'm doing is dogma and politics. But if we go back to the very beginning, at the very start, I was talking about Russian dogma and socialism because the battle has basically come from Russian sources. And what I did say is that the Germans back in the 60s and 70s were blaming Hitler for the poor performance, and the nuance of what's happened in modern German academia is that they've improved that research. That people like Karl-Heinz Frieser has come along and has written this book, which gives a German impression and a German view, and that tells a different story. It doesn't mean that it's not written in there that some of the German soldiers are from the National Socialist Leadership Corps, that some of the officers are downright Nazis. I mean, if you read, here's the thing, if you read Room's personnel papers, it says he's a good National Socialist, but he's not a Nazi member. Well, you know, that could also be like saying, well, he's not a member of the Conservative Party, but he behaves like a conservative. Yeah. So is he a conservative or not? Is he a Nazi or not? And you're left with this inner problem that because you can't ask him, well, did you believe? And I can assure you, you talk to any German soldier who'd fought in the Second World War and got them to the side where they're not being recorded, they're going to say, well, yeah, of course, Hitler was our hero because he gave us this, that, and the other. And I remember a long conversation with Henry Mettelmann, who was the German tank man who wrote his memoirs, a working class man from Hamburg, wrote his memoirs in the 80s, 90s. And I sat with him many times and we had long meetings talking about, well, because that's how I would think then, which is to say, are you a Nazi? And he'd say, no, I wasn't a Nazi, but I was in the Hitler Youth and I believed in Hitler. It was only when I was in Stalingrad or fighting around the area of Stalingrad, I realized what a stupid fool I'd been. Well, you know, there's loads of people like that. We could actually say today there's people like Putin who are behaving in much the same way with his soldiers, you know, treating them, saying how wonderful they are. Well, down at the ground, they're being treated like hell and there's huge losses. Yeah. And ideology is always going to be that problem between the military historian who's trying to look at the battle and the political historical chap trying to look at the politics of the war. And sometimes they don't overlap. I've tried to overlap by talking about the Holocaust today.
Yeah, it's always a complicated thing because, you know, and it's come up in the sidebar. There's at least one person who just doesn't quite get what this discussion is all about. And it's, you know, I always get asked, you know, why don't I have more German historians on the channel? And I'm inviting German historians, but it can be very uncomfortable for them to come on and talk about this stuff because they often just get labeled as something that they're not. You know, but why are you interested in the past? Why are you raking? So it is complicated, and it's always going to have that nuance. But we're going down an interesting and very important rabbit hole, but I'd like you to take us through your last few slides, if you may, please, Mr.
Okay, well, here's the cemeteries. So in Hanova, and here's a fascinating thing, given everything that's been going on between Poland and Russia for the last 100+ years. When I last went there, the graves of the Russian soldiers were being well looked after, and many of the soldiers in the graveyard were women. I just happened to pick this picture up of this young lady from the film, Liberation. But I also was able to find a picture of the ladies actually honoring a female Russian soldier who had been killed during the battle, and they were looking after the grave. And this is the locals. Now, if you went into that area, some of them are Polish, some of them are Belarusian, and some of them are mixed, and it's all a bit of a confusion. So if we move on. The German soldiers were eventually moved to a graveyard in Bartosha or Bartosen, which was part of East Prussia. The graveyard was put together, I think, in 2002, but I could be wrong. I went there. I was able to find some of the troops, not all of them, and they're buried in that there. And if we move on.
Go to number 60 now, aren't we, to wrap things up?
Yeah. The rest of this talk, in terms of PowerPoint and notes, is going to go on our Fallout Substack point. And if you want to know about the things I've discussed today, they're in the books. And that's not to say buy them. Go to the library and get them.
Well, buying them is better, though. You know, it's damn the trees. They've already been cut down. They're just sitting in warehouses now. They better be on people's shelves being read.
Yeah, they're all from B&V Shop. So that's really the story. And anybody who reads that some of those will know that I am no way a supporter of National Socialism or in any way trying to give the impression that the German soldiers deserve to win the Second World War. No, what we're talking about is how people respond in war and how they behave in war. And we have to understand these things because we haven't really bothered to look at it before. And if you notice, I've kind of in my trade been more interested in the working class, ordinary type soldier rather than the commanders, the generals, the officers, and because they're missing. Their history has not really been written, and it's not just the British Army, the Germans, the Russians. They need that story needs to come back, and as it does, for example, about the Russian women.
Yeah,
you know, it's always a chapter in like Catherine Meridell's book about the Russian army, but the actual books talking about the women in the Russian army who fought and died, it's an important subject, and it's not always carried over. People don't talk about that.
And you can have two thoughts in your head at the same time. I mean, I found that in Budapest last year with all the Soviet graves there, and again, lots of women buried there. And they were, when they came in, they were at that moment liberators. But of course, Budapest becomes Soviet controlled and part of the Eastern Bloc for the next 3 decades, and they were anything but liberators. But that doesn't mean you can't have those two thoughts in your head at the same time. You can say, okay, at the time they fought through, this person died as part of the liberating force. Then the force they were being part of then became a different force later on. That's what happens to countries. You can vote for a political party in one election because you stand by their values, and then 20 years down the line, the values have changed, and the party now has a different label, and your opinions of it have changed. It's okay, folks, to have these complicated reactions to this. And when I do my tours, and you do your staff ride tours, I always use my hat as an analogy. I said there are times to wear the emotional hat and there are times to wear your analytical hat, and sometimes you can't wear both at the same time. So the cemeteries you go to and you say, oh, these people died in conflict, be they on this side or that side, they died in conflict, that's what happened there. And then later on you can say, let's look at the ideology these ones are fighting for. Did this necessarily make the world a better place, etc., etc.? But you have to kind of change hats to do that. That's kind of my summing up of where we are.
I mean, if you looked at Hanovka and Białystok in the period under Russian occupation from 1945 onwards, the locals are being terribly treated under the terror, and many of the partisans get murdered by the NKVD, which later became the KGB. That is not a happy area, and it's very interesting. If we went to 2021, almost a year before Putin's invasion, he was actually pushing refugees from Syria through the frontier at this very place, because Białystok it's got that Polish sovereignty links with the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but it's also got Belarus links because Belarus has got the larger part of the forest, and it's all to do with Belarus nationality. And actually, Putin was using that to exploit the sensitivity of the politics in the region. And I go back to the Polish-Soviet War of 1920. This forest is a primary battleground. This is right in the center of it. Yeah, this is where the two armies are fighting through. So there is a lot of sensitivity, but at some point you have to say, well, I'm not doing an academic talk on the nature of National Socialism or the horror of fascism. What I'm talking about is men in battle and how men in battle react to a given situation, and that's what we're understanding today. I'm not there suggesting that any of these German soldiers were Nazis, although there is evidence that some of them might be, or that all of the Russian soldiers were communists, of which some of them might be.
Yeah. No, and on that note, let's leave things. So, Dr. Phil, as always, a masterclass, but you've given me lots of things to think about. A virtual headache will be in my head later on today. But folks, history is complicated. The devil is in the nuance, and it's okay to be conflicted about these things. And sometimes those of us in the West, we prefer the studies where it's cleaner. You know, the goodies and the bad guys are easier to identify, and it's a little bit more like a kind of a simple movie script. But actually, a lot of the war is far more complicated than that. The Sino-Japanese War gets into that kind of complication towards the end. So who are the good guys again here? What wars do that? That's why it's interesting to discuss them. So there we are, folks. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your comments. You'll see me back again on Monday. We are looking at the partisan activity in Italy with Caroline Moorhead, which I'm really looking forward to, and then lots more stuff coming up. So click like and subscribe. Go and check out Dr. Phil's pages and books, and we will see you all again after the weekend. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Cheers.